Crime levels continue to increase in the country. An associate professor at the University of the Western Cape, Lukas Muntingh, believes that the country could do without the Minister of Police. Professor Muntingh says the Minister has failed to fulfill his mandate. For more on this, I'm joined by the Prof. Prof, thank you so much for making time for us. So this is a ministry that existed before under other titles. Even in our neighboring countries, that political control of the police resorts typically under other ministries. How did we choose to have the exclusive cabinet portfolio on police?
Good afternoon. The exclusive cabinet portfolio for police is a bit unusual, as you mentioned in your introduction. We don't see it commonly in other countries. It first appeared as a ministerial portfolio a long time ago in 1966 in the second Verwoerd cabinet, with John Vorster being the Minister of Justice and Police. And shortly thereafter, it was then made a single portfolio of police. And so roughly since the 1960s, we've had this portfolio of police. And my point is really that we need to go back and ask the question, do we really need an exclusive portfolio for police when so many other components of the criminal justice system and broadly law enforcement and safety depends on the police? Would it not be better to have a portfolio that is structurally integrated with other responsibilities within the criminal justice cluster?
Yeah. Given that crime is such a big issue in this country, Prof, what if someone makes an argument that, well, we actually need this portfolio that focuses exclusively on police in order to fight the scourge of crime? I mean, data on police performance is not encouraging. You see the increase in the number of murders. You've seen a decrease in the number of successful prosecutions, the high number of human rights violations. And on top of that, you've got police who themselves are implicated in this crime.
Yes, and that is really the point. We've had this exclusive portfolio on police now for decades. And the one thing that is very, very clear from the data we have looked at is the lack of integration in the criminal justice system. In other words, that there needs to be performance indicators that does not measure only the police in isolation from the prosecuting authority, from the productivity of the courts. We need to look at key performance indicators that measures impact across the entire system. That is lacking at the moment, and that is, at least in part, a consequence of this exclusive portfolio focusing on the police. Because the Minister of Police, regardless of who the individual is filling that position, will always, being a politician, and it's natural to expect, that person will always try and portray the performance of his portfolio in the best possible light. The consequence of that is actually counterproductive as it stands now, because the police focuses on different key performance indicators than what, for example, the prosecution service does. And so the emphasis must really to bring about integration, and that, I argue in my article, is what we need to look at in terms of the division of ministerial portfolios.
Yeah, and let's look at that role of the police minister, because my understanding is that that's a largely policy development function, right? And yet you've got the current minister constantly accused of interfering in operational matters.
Yes, it is indeed the case that the Constitution obliges the Minister of Police to develop, or let us phrase it correctly, the Minister responsible for policing to develop a national policing policy. To the best of my knowledge, that has not been done since 1996, when that became part of the constitutional obligations of the Minister responsible for policing. So that is not being done. So the one thing that the minister should be doing has not been done. And as you highlight, there is interference in operational issues, which I think is again a function of this exclusivity in portfolio on the police. And we can look at the performance agreement of the current minister, and we see it's replete with operational targets to increase certain things by a certain percentage and to decrease other things by a certain percentage. Those are not strategic and policy targets. Those are operational targets. And I think we need to ask questions about that and whether that is appropriate at the ministerial level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So is the problem here, Prof, the development of that policy, or is the problem the implementation of this policy?
Well, it's both. The first point is there isn't a policy, and the Constitution is clear on how that policy must be developed. It firstly says it's the minister's responsibility, and secondly, it says the minister must do so in consultation with the provinces. And it enables then the development of multiple policies on policing to accommodate the needs and priorities of provinces. So, and it's completely understandable that, for example, in the Western Cape, we have different policing needs and therefore enforcement needs and thus prosecution needs than in the Eastern or in the Free State, where they really struggle with stock theft, which is not so much of an issue in the Western Cape, where we perhaps have more a problem with illicit trade in marine products or drug smuggling or so forth. So one needs to accommodate those provincial differences, and that has not been done.
Mm-hmm. And I guess the low levels of public trust in the SAPS, that's not helping much, is it?
No, and this is something that has developed over time. If we go back to what are the core requirements for democratic policing, as we term it in the literature, is upholding the rule of law, being accountable, and certainly working in service of the public in a procedurally fair manner. Now, people's experiences have not been positive over time, and so we've seen over the last decade or so that trust in the police has declined, and we know this from the Afrobarometer surveys, so it's not something that is plucked from the air. There are proper high-quality surveys done to establish this. And so when people don't trust the police, it results in a legitimacy deficit. And we see that in how people interact with the police, the views of the police, and also the expectations of the police.
Yeah.
But we also see it in the lack of discipline in the police. And those are really very, very worrying trends.
Yeah. So let's say this portfolio is done away with and it falls now under other departments. Is that going to improve the coordination in the criminal justice system? In other words, what would be the benefits?
One would hopefully see that there is some prioritization, and I support that process be driven by the prosecution authority, and in particular the prosecution service within the National Prosecuting Authority, that at least at provincial level certain priorities are identified. Let's say, for example, organized crime in the Western Cape and stock theft in the Free State and so on, and that the prosecution drives those priorities to ensure that the correct things are investigated, that the quality of investigations are of requisite standards to ensure efficient and effective prosecutions, and that we do target those crimes that have a real impact on public safety and people's perceptions of safety, because perceptions of safety are extremely important. But we really need to ensure that there is coordination and cooperation, and that is driven to ensure that the right people are prosecuted and convicted, and and imprisoned where imprisonment is appropriate.
Yeah. Professor Lukas Muntingh, thank you so much for joining us for this important conversation.